China and the World Forum, the US-China Technology Rivalry, the IP Quagmire. Warm greetings to everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today for this event. I am Si-En, your MC for today. This forum is organized by World Scientific Publishing and named after the journal China and the World, Ancient and Modern Silk Road, to promote communication and exchange on China and BRI-related themes. The executive editors of the China and the World Journal are also very pleased to announce that the latest issue can be freely accessed by creating an account with World Scientific. Please visit the journal's website in the chat box for more information, and this will be shown again after the end of the dialogue. Now, for a few housekeeping notes before we start. You are most welcome to keep your cameras on, but please keep your mics muted while the forum is ongoing. There will be a Q&A session after the talk, so please feel free to post your questions in the chat at any time. After posting your question in the chat, you may also be invited to unmute and read it out during the Q&A session if you are comfortable doing so. Also, this webinar will be recorded and posted online. Today, we are very pleased to have with us our special guest, leading IP expert, Dr. Richard Thurston, the former Senior Vice President and General Counsel of Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company Limited, and consultant to Dr. Morris Chang. Currently, Dr. Thurston is of counsel to Duane Morris LLP. Our co-moderator for today is Professor Zhiqun Zhu, Professor and Chair of the International Relations at Bucknell University, USA. He is also a member of the National Committee on United States-China Relations. And last but not least, our moderator for this event will be Professor Da Hsuan Feng, Honorary Dean of Hainan University Belt and Road Research Institute and Chief Advisor of the China Silk Road I-Valley Research Institute. They will be the main speakers for the dialogue and will reply to questions during the Q&A session as well. Now, without further ado, let us welcome Dr. Thurston to kick off the discussion.
Make sure. There we go. Okay, let me get back. Greetings, everyone. I'm trying to get my screen share working here. So it's a great honor and pleasure to attend this webinar, this forum with you, today. Speaking to you from New York, and it's very great honor, that Dr. Feng invited me to attend. I've known, Dr. Feng for many decades, quite honestly, when we were in Dallas together. So I thank you, and it's nice to meet Dr. Zhu as well from one of my favorite colleges of Bucknell. So thanks to World Scientific in sponsoring this program, and I just want to go over briefly the agenda. I will talk about some very special historical experiences in my life, and then review the historical background that I believe is very important, and then look at the last three topics with the importance of IP, the technology rivalry, as well as what's happening and where this may all take us. My career started back really when I was in my formative stages, career facing China, because my family had had a long history of dealing with China, and particularly I heard stories from my great aunt who had taught Song Meiling, who went on to be Madam Chiang Kai-shek in the United States when she was here in the United States. And then I proceeded to go to Taiwan to work on my PhD dissertation in 1975, 76, where I met my lovely wife. And I was doing research on Chinese legal history, and actually the Chinese civil law reform during the period 1906 through 1930. So that's what cemented my interest, and then was very fortunate to have and continue to have a long career in and out of law firms and corporations. Texas Instruments, where I was there for 13 years as assistant general counsel, and then also TSMC, where I ended up being there 13 years, including being senior vice president and general counsel of that fine organization. And back in after I basically completed my PhD coursework and the defense of my dissertation in 1979, my wife and I went to China, a reunification of the family. Her branch of the family had gone to Taiwan in 1949, and so the family had not seen each other during that intermediate period of time. So while we were in China, we spent a month traveling around throughout China. And more often than not, my wife was confused as my interpreter, because at that point in time, there were not many Caucasians around in China. But during that period, one of our excursions, we took a trip on the overnight coal-fired train from Xi'an down to Shanghai. A very interesting, to say the least, trip. And during the course of that trip, and this was in basically late summer, in September of 1980. Throughout a good portion of the trip, in fact, 24/7 was broadcasting over the intercom system about various, in many ways, propaganda. Many of the guests on the train were on their way actually to Beijing for Party Congress. During that train ride, a significant portion of it actually, coincidentally, happened to be talking about China's path to innovation, to creation. Again, remember, this is 1980. And I was the only non-Chinese on board that train. And the broadcasts, of course, were purely in Mandarin, but fortunately, I understood most of it, and my wife could help me out, where I didn't. The themes of this broadcast really had to do with intellectual property, with actually innovation and developing the learning tools, which are very relevant to our discussion today. And throughout the broadcast, there are key points that were constantly made and remade. Dealt with China's focus on communal rights of the community, of collaboration amongst the community members. And then I remember very distinctly the portion at some length talking about how to reverse engineer. Among other things, they talked about GE turbines and also Caterpillar tractors. So how could we reverse engineer to get the benefits of these great technologies, as they would say? And in fact, as I note in my bullet here, that part of the emphasis was on the importance of copying, because this, they throw in quotes from Chairman Mao, but this was a process of refining for China, and then public dissemination to benefit the state and the people of the state. And they really went on and showed some examples of how, and real examples of how Japan and Korea and Taiwan had followed similar models. But they noted that there were different twists in those models, but particularly at this point in time, the three countries I just mentioned were in fact also borrowing from the West. They emphasized the need to learn quickly, to make up for a lot of the lost time that had occurred They did praise, which I became very fortunate in my next topic to see firsthand, the prowess of China's institutions for research and development. And they said that they believed, actually the goal at the time, again, this is 1980, was that China would become the world patent leader within 50 years. So 50 years from 1980. So we're, approaching that point in time. So the conversation, I just kind of put it back in the back of my mind because I had just started my law, career at Duane Morris. I had graduated from law school and had obtained my PhD all during that process in the previous 10 years. I stayed at Duane Morris from 1976 through 1984, and again in September of '84, another September month, I joined Texas Instruments and was very fortunate to join them in the legal department. And I was hired specifically at the time to handle East Asian matters and particularly China. Dr. Mark Shepard and Fred Busey and team believed that the future of TI and technology innovation was centered in China. So what we did in 1985, I first went over to China in January as part of a group that we proceeded to do a significant level of...
Dick, by TI, yeah. You meant Texas Instruments.
Texas Instruments, correct. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And we proceeded to do a major investigation into the state of China's semiconductor industry, or I should say at that time, semiconductor capabilities. And we had been granted the right access to many of China's research institutions, as well as China's factories, which were, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a few minutes, but old radio factories that had been established, which they were trying to convert into semiconductor factories. But throughout that investigation, we were also fortunate to be able to talk with many of Chinese leaders, and especially China's future leaders, and to discuss really how should a semiconductor industry develop, how should it evolve, and also since TI was just starting to be known by the world as a great technology patent company. You remember in 1984, the U.S. created the ITC relating to international issues. They created the International Court of Appeals in D.C. The ITC had been around, and that started to enable Texas Instruments patents to be protected. In fact, in the early mid 80s, a lot of the TI did not pursue patent infringement cases because more often than not, the courts would overturn them. Also, we did not pursue trade secret cases because almost all of them were being thrown out, particularly by Texas courts. So US was in a very nascent stage of actually recognizing protection for technology related patents. And also US was still struggling with the differentiation of protecting technology, innovation, trade secrets with the right of freedom to work, to move around and to work. But what we found out was a confirmation of what I had heard in the summer of 1980, is that government leaders talked about the principles, the basic principles of intellectual assets, intellectual know-how, capability, as I had defined it in the previous bullet. And also, they were more interested in working with Texas Instruments to create some new age joint ventures, and also to have TI partner with them in creating a foundry. These discussions were occurring in the mid to later part of the decade, and particularly as they were aware of what they would call their son, Chairman Morris Zhang. You remember, Morris was born in China. They considered him one of their sons, and they knew of what was then viewed as an experiment by Texas Instruments, and actually some of the TI's management felt that TSMC would fail, to look at how they could use a new manufacturing tool such as a foundry to leapfrog technology development. That was always the key thing. They knew that they were lagging, and they had to find a way to take what was proven laboratory capabilities in China, in places such as Xi'an and Shijiazhuang, to mass production. So that was a core focus of our discussion. And in fact, we did help China create a new patent system and process. At the time, there were several other very famous and very significant influencers also that I came to be known, such as Jerry Cohen and Randy Edwards, were in China, as well as a few others that were teaching the early stages of Chinese law. I will add that my background in Chinese legal history and thinking was also very much influenced by Professor Long Xiaochuan, who was at the University of Virginia at the time. And he was one of my readers and on my panel for my PhD dissertation. TI was in negotiating many joint ventures. I was constantly in China, and then in fact moved to Tokyo in 1987 through 1990 for 3.5 years, in large part to negotiate ventures in China, Japan, and Korea, as well as Singapore, our host here today. Two of the more interesting negotiations in China occurred. One was with a company then called Alcap, but Alcap was trying to negotiate. In fact, we did successfully negotiate a joint venture with Alcap to manufacture for TI in our oil exploration division called GSI. And GSI had a very active exploration program in China. But what the Chinese wanted to do, and we were in agreement with certain controls and black box programs to protect our core IP, was to build 3D data processing computers. We already had a contractual joint venture for older technology in Xi'an. And so we were negotiating with Alcap. Why is Alcap important? Alcap's very important because it was owned and managed by a young gentleman at the time, the name Larry Young. His Chinese name is Reng Jijian, the son of Reng Yiren, and he was being groomed to create and to grow CITIC. But as this point was a learning curve, and particularly to learn about technologies and its importance to China. We successfully negotiated this joint venture, but was ultimately blocked by the Department of Defense and the US government, and very much for similar reasons that we see today in the Huawei issues, Huawei related issues. There's always has been a strong paranoia within the US, and some of it certainly justified, as I'll talk about shortly, with respect to theft of intellectual property. And that's because of the fundamental characteristics that I described earlier. We did another joint venture discussions with on the clicks-on device that TI had. This was a sensor for which actually the patents had long expired, but there was a tremendous amount of trade secrets. And what had happened is actually, while I was in Tokyo living there, it was brought to my attention that there were two companies that were infringing our intellectual property. The patents expired, so it was not patent infringement. The head of that division came to me and wanted me to bring lawsuits. And actually, I said no at the time. And I got into trouble with a few executives, but then Chairman Jerry Junkins strongly supported me because I said, look, they have not proven to be successful, have they? And the president of the group said, no, maybe only 1% quality coming out. I said, well, then don't worry. I said, why not worry? I said, they'll be back to us. Sure enough, 2 years later, the company did come back, admitted its sins, and asked us for forgiveness and to become a joint venture partner. We did. At that point in time, I had negotiated the joint venture, and I became actually the majority owner in the early 90s when we consummated this. And we never bragged about it because at that time, supposedly joint ventures did not allow majority ownership. In fact, we had about 60%. The company ended up, the joint venture ended up ultimately becoming wholly owned by TI before it sold off the division and ended up, I think, getting about 80% market share in China and developed a lot more in the way of patent protection around that product in China. So it serves as a background of some of the trends, some of the undercurrents that were going on, and led me. Then ultimately, I left TI, joined a law firm, and then joined TSMC in December of 2001. I won't read this slide, but as I start off, I'll just give you the background. As I note at the top of the slide, during our discussions with the Chinese officials in 1990s, and this is while we're negotiating joint ventures and actually looking at other joint ventures, particularly with respect to semiconductor manufacturing. We had been negotiating a number of joint ventures at the time of Tiananmen in 1989. I was actually in Beijing through May of that year, just before Tiananmen actually occurred, and was down at the square. But we were negotiating actually semiconductor joint ventures at that point in time. During this, the officials actually admitted that their centrally planned government initiatives had failed and had caused China to lag significantly with the West and Japan and even Korea as it was evolving as a semiconductor giant. And in the meantime, TSMC started to grow and ultimately really took off after its acquisition of Worldwide Semiconductor in the 2000 and 2001 period in the integration. And they realized that they needed a new approach to IC investment. So this is when they started very much in earnest with state subsidization in order to leapfrog over what would be the normal development trail. And that brings us to then the TSMC lawsuits. As I note in here, there were multiple ones against SMIC, initially for patent infringement, then ultimately for trade secret infringement. And this was an issue that actually arose out of the acquisition of Worldwide Semiconductor, because Richard Zhang left Worldwide, where he was the CEO, and instead of joining TSMC as he had promised Morris Zhang, he went to create SMIC in China, and again with significant Chinese monies. And I will add that during our massive discovery efforts, which you can read about here in summary, we never saw one iota of any evidence that would link the central government to the trade secret theft directly. What was really at issue was the fact that Richard Zhang had promised that SMIC would be up and running semiconductor, state-of-the-art 0.18 micron plant within basically 2 years of digging the first shovel of dirt. Impossible, except, it's impossible on your own, but was certainly possible when the massive amount of trade secrets were misappropriated and stolen from TSMC. And on top of that, the court records will show that around 250 TSMC employees were hired. And as in the record of the court proceedings, it shows that each one of those employees was asked to bring, quote unquote, a gift. That gift was trade secrets. So during this period of time, we learned an awful lot about the practices of Chinese industry and the multiple tiered effect. And then, as I said, we had our first lawsuit ended with settlement agreement in 2005. But as the jury verdict found in the second trial, and that was a successful verdict for us, within 5 days of the ink drying on that settlement agreement, SMIC breached the agreement and continued to use our trade secrets against the terms of the settlement. And that's what brought us into a second suit in 2006 that ended in 2009 with a jury verdict and then a very significant settlement agreement. So that also gave me a lot more insight into what was being done, but also throughout our use of the discovery process and looking at how and why this happened, the history of China dealing with intellectual creativity came again very, very apparent. And this related to how the company management would train and teach the individuals and encourage them to bring trade secrets of TSMC and other companies. We did observe in our discovery other US companies in particular that had their trade secrets misappropriated, during this process of trying to create a world-class semiconductor company, which in fact, SMIC is today. Shortly after our lawsuits, there was a government panel that looked into what really happened. SMIC, proceeded to really start to invest a lot more money into R&D and to do their own innovation, which was resulting in a catch-up game. But I have seen nothing today, up through today, that would indicate that there were any of those types of practices going on at all within SMIC. And in fact, I have seen very little to indicate that some of the concerns that exist actually do exist. But the earliest history with China was always full of focus on creativity, as we all know. And initially, of course, intellectual property was owned by the emperor and belonged solely to the emperor. And the laws that existed were focused on protecting the emperor's intellectual property that was actually, of course, created by many, many other people. And so throughout this period of time, these principles that I mentioned earlier really continue to be refined, quite honestly, in the process of tremendous creativity. We've seen a lot of it documented in Joseph Needham's Science and Civilization and many other works that have come out since that great volume series started decades ago. But from my ongoing research, and I've just really very, very briefly summarized it here, China has been constantly constantly looking at and working on reform of intellectual property. If you go back to the mid 1800s and the infamous Opium Wars and the Second Opium War, which is known as the Arrow War, intellectual property actually was discussed in treaties that were signed. You'll recall Britain, France, the U.S., and a few other countries were involved in the expeditions. And what evolved out of those, we have, of course, in 1858 was the Treaty of Tianjin, relating to the United States, was the combination of the Treaty of Nanjing, but more importantly, the Treaty of Wangxia. I think the English is called, has it printed always as Wanghia, Wanghia, but it's Wangxia. That was the one. The Wangxia was one involving Caleb Cushing in those issues. But there was always the discussion of intellectual property and that they need to have reforms. But it was always hollow promises by the Chinese. And then, you recall that as a result of these treaties, a number of what we call treaty ports were opened. These were zones such as in Shanghai of the Americans, where the foreign powers had their own unique extraterritorial rights. Well, one of the most interesting things on which I've been working on a book relates to the U.S. Treaty port in Shanghai. And in fact, and I'll just mention that the Treaty of Wangxia then was ended in 1943. But throughout this period, particularly during the period 1906 through 1930, the focus of my PhD dissertation, the U.S. had a fully empowered U.S. district court in Shanghai. And among decisions that it was rendering related to intellectual property disputes. And therefore, China was, and as in other treaty ports, but especially the U.S., getting its foot wet. Many Chinese actually would end up taking disputes even between Chinese to the U.S. court because China did not yet have any intellectual property laws effectively in place. Throughout this period of time, 1906, 1930, the U.S. and other foreign powers put significant pressure on China to enact intellectual property reform, to change its courts. And in fact, China did under the Republican era that began in 1911, where we're seeing the anniversary of that. What happened were, and I just mentioned a few of it, but copyright law was passed and then amended in 1910, 1915. You had a patent law and trademark law that also came into place. And throughout this period of time, China's courts were the more well-established ones that were not in areas of civil disturbance were starting to practice it. I've reviewed actually cases of what was the predecessor to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court around 1927, but previous to that it was called the Dalian. And the decisions, there are intellectual property decisions within that court's holdings. But nevertheless, there was constant criticism, although my dissertation says that, in fact, during this period of time, China did make great strides to impose intellectual property regimes that were really much more Western in nature, and in many ways, very successfully at that. Hang on, it's not clicking. So, when I look at, what does that all mean today and where are we heading, and skipping over a lot of history in between, because they're during the 50s, 60s, up through now, as we all know, a huge amount of intellectual property legislation, new courts, IP courts, existing courts also do it. And in fact, in my SMIC case, part of the litigation was in Beijing and the intellectual property division of the China Supreme Court. And we at TSMC received a very favorable decision that actually threw out the defendant's claims in China. And the opinion that was written by the 3-judge panel was one of the best written opinions on Chinese, but one of the best written opinions that I have seen. It equated as much to any Ninth Circuit, or other Circuit Court of Appeals in the United States. But technology throughout my period of time, and what I've even seen as history, has been foundational, for China, as has IP in a different sense, as it has with the US, and therein lies part of the major part of the problem. But what I found to be interesting when I was at UVA doing work on my PhD, my colleague, a close friend, gentleman that I'll never forget because he was addicted to Coca-Cola, but his dissertation was actually on not law, but on medicine. And he studied the divergence, how worldwide medicine started fundamentally the same, but then the Western medicine took a different approach that was cardiovascular in its orientation. Chinese and Eastern medicine took a different approach that was more focused on the neural nervous system, as we have seen with acupuncture coming about. So similarly, that in my discussions with him actually led me to further drive my focus on a similar thing with respect to law. When we look at U.S. law, we see, excuse me, some fundamental characteristics that, such as the rule of law, individuality, and encouraging individual innovation, but rewarding that innovation. I've seen over the years, including the trade wars that we are now seeing, and I've seen a number of them. First, of course, starting with Japan. That's why I, in part, moved to Japan. TI had me move to Japan as order also to be on the ground in the trade war, the semiconductor wars that were being asserted against Japanese companies for borrowing technology, for infringing patents. So the same song, but a different tune from what we're seeing today. So the IP quiver of arrows never really stuck. In this case, has bounced off the Great Wall that we've come to know from a historical and also a figurative, point of view. China, on the other hand, has codified laws as the U.S. has evolved as well. Less of a common law system, although it exists, and certainly I found that to be true in my dissertation. In fact, there was a major investigation by an international group that actually codified a lot of China's precedential value in its common law that existed, not just the law of the Qing or the Tang, dynasties. And courts did arise, and courts, though, and during times of stability, were very influential. However, took a different approach. And during the evolution of the post-49 period, we've seen, that while China is still knowledge-based, it's more knowledge-based to its enterprises. And there is some degree of conflict that is continuing to arise, as we've seen, between private enterprises and state-owned or state-serving enterprises. The collaborative efforts, from what I have seen, continue to exist. But more importantly, IP assets have been used from my earliest discussions with the government to lock in large-scale manufacturing. This employs people. This gets products and technology out to the workforce and actually helps to increase their national wealth and power. Not much different from the US, but certainly a different approach. Taiwan is a unique element in all of this. As I said earlier, I started a lot of my career relating to Taiwan because with Texas Instruments, we were trying to protect our IP in one of the more important manufacturing sites that TI had at the time. And it was at a time when Taiwan had relatively no, and certainly no substantive, IP laws. And in fact, we got Chiang Kai-shek and, ultimately it was Jiang Jingwo, who agreed, that to the extent that TI would find any infringement in China, that even if the laws did not exist, he would ensure that the government would take steps to stop that infringing activity. But infringement was significant, as we know, as a learning curve. Even some of you will know that with Needham's Science and Civilization, that was one of the most heavily pirated books in Taiwan during the 1970s. But what has happened in the case of Taiwan, it is a thorn, and it's also a thorn for another reason, as I learned during my studies of history, but particularly while I was out at visiting with Chinese officials during the period of time of leading up to Tiananmen, is that in many people's minds, particularly the geomancers, there is an East-West dynasty that continues to exist and is, in fact, a major catalyst for a lot of the efforts we see in China of bullying and putting pressure on Taiwan from the Taiwan perspective. China views that Taiwan, as long as Taiwan exists, it prevents the reunification of China, and therefore we're still in the tail years of the Qing dynasty in some of the geomancers' minds. But again, the trade wars that we've seen, have also, I think, continued to have a lot of hollow, promises on both sides. And of course, right now, perhaps the most significant discussions that are being held are between the USTR and Catherine Tai on the US side and our counterparts over in China, relating to the trade agreement that was executed in phase one during the President Trump administration. And, this is, very important to see where and how, particularly the Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of State, USTR handle this, going, forward. So what I, wanted to do is to get off the stage fairly quickly so we can get to some excellent, I hope, questions and answers, and looking at how we are, what we are seeing today. And I have two slides really related to that. And what's driving, I think, both countries in so many different ways is perceived threats to national security. U.S., of course, is driven, and as I mentioned, I first saw this back in the 1980s when the Department of Defense blocked the joint venture that we were going to do with Alcap, and that was for fears that the Chinese would be able to use that for intelligence gathering and to also take away valuable trade secrets at that particular time. There's a fear of the use of innovation to influence, competitive and anti-competitive development. But I think that the U.S. is looking at China as, manufacturing capability as an ongoing threat and decimation, hollowing out of U.S. manufacturing, and uses the supply chain issue as a motivator, to try to get more anti-China, legislation. As I said, before, there has been a lot of merit to fears and concerns of misappropriation of technology, to infringement issues. And that will be ongoing, just as it had been, and I think evolved through Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Israel, and France. I was involved in a major sting operation decades ago for TI and working closely with the FBI, where we caught the French government trying to download what was then loggable computers. You know, we'd go out to dinner and they'd come in and take out the hard drive, copy it, and put it back in. When caught them, and that was related to some of TI's existing technologies at the time. Where I see one of the greatest weaknesses, and I think, you know, the Biden administration has been trying to, since really the an Obama administration, has been the fact that we are not a country that has essentially planned and essentially coordinated economic ministry, or what we call cabinet positions, whereas this has been a strength of Asian, countries as they've evolved, and most famous, infamously, and especially for my period of dealing with them extensively, was dealing with when it started, known as MIDI, and today METI, and we had similar issues, similar trade wars, semiconductor agreements, and the like, and of course, very strong TI lawsuits against, at one time, 7 Japanese companies and Samsung, for patent infringement. So that is the same old story, rewritten in Mandarin as compared to Japanese Korean at the time. I think there still is a strong drive for seeing wealth and power based on innovation. And we have, while the U.S. has its agencies that do significant amount of R&D, and many of us have been involved in that, I've found over time to be greater coordination of China's research institutions with corporate world, and that follows the Japanese model in so many ways. And then, close customer collaboration, which of course the U.S. companies and TSMC and many other semiconductors have had. My questions, to everyone else, and certainly what I'm, more than willing to, look at too, is, are our options limited? I believe they are, but I do believe we still have some options vis-a-vis the U.S. and China relationships, and I hope that some of the efforts that are going on behind the scenes in establish and hopefully engaging. I'd like to see it as re-engaging, but I think a lot of people view it as new engagement with China. I hope that those are successful. I think that hardline position of the U.S. on China intellectual property and the trade issues has been a major contributor to the failure of, or the so-called failure of, the supply chain. More importantly, when I was at TI and then at TSMC, and we concluded in both organizations that we could not afford to ignore China innovation, the tremendous capabilities of Chinese universities and research organizations to evolve US based technology. It cannot be ignored. We cannot turn an eye to it. And in fact, I think part of the issue today is many US companies and many other companies, particularly European ones, and this is true especially in the 5G area, are not ignoring it. They realize that we have to move ahead and to be more cooperative. When I first started with TI and looking at China investment, I did caution the company to hold back, and we did some of our most advanced technologies below the threshold that the Wassenaar, required, the Wassenaar Convention, required. So because of the concern of the temptation of people, and it's around the world to borrow what they oftentimes think are their innovations for their new careers as they move out. And this continues to be a challenge for all of us. With that in mind, the laws of many countries, including Taiwan, which I helped to get passed, are differentiating the right to work and the right to protect valuable intellectual property. I think trade secrets is really where the battle lies, although China's efforts to become the world dominant patent holder means that there's a tremendous focus on quantity rather than quality of patents. Today, one of the real questions is what will be the ongoing availability in the short term of China courts to US companies where infringement does occur. And I think that we have to, again, have some sort of dialogue that bridges the gaps that currently exist. And in the meantime, we are still seeing many companies, of course, sales in non-security concerned technologies are continuing, although at more of a snail's pace than they were. But the challenge is for all of us, I think, to try to encourage a more meaningful dialogue. And I thank, once again, World Scientific for encouraging that, and particularly with their Silk Road initiatives. I know Dr. Feng has been very much behind that dialogue. It's so important. And again, I'd like to thank everyone for your attention today, and I'll turn the program back over to the monitors. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dick. Let me, before we begin the questions, I begin the questions from Dr. Zhu and I think we would like to just ask one of the participants who seems to have asked a very good question. HP Wang, whoever you are you still on?
Yes.
Okay. Can you show your face on the screen and you can ask the question directly?
I don't know what I wrote. I don't know.
Well,
okay, let me see.
Also tell people who you are and where are you?
I'm in upstate New York.
Okay.
Okay. My question is,
I don't see your face yet. You have to come in real.
oh, come on. I'm not presentable. It's too early.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. You know that before Xi Jinping visited Obama in 2010 or 2011, that was a big push trying to find intellectual property theft cases against China, and didn't happen. Somehow we talk about this for a decade. We, in general public, have not heard any real big cases in the media, newspaper or TVs. It's not like the Wenhe Li case 20-some years ago. I just wonder if this is part of a propaganda war. The other concern I have is the current trend, that under government or political pressure, hope will not turn into another Wenhe Li case. I call that the biggest joke in the intelligence community. This is just my concern, my questions. Okay.
Okay. Dick?
Dr. Thurston, I think you're muted.
You have to unmute, Dick.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know how I got muted. Okay, thanks. A good question. And I would say, I think that we have to distinguish two aspects to your question. One is in the commercial industry. There have been a large number of cases that have been handled around the world relating to China corporate intellectual property theft, misappropriation and theft. those more often than not remained fairly quiet, including, TSMC case. We did not publicize it a lot. I did talk about it. Dr. Morris Chang talked about it. And we did have some public discussion, but at the end of the day, what people don't realize is that as a result of the settlement, TSMC got $1.7 billion worth of value out of that settlement, combination of cash, a combination of stock, and combination of license arrangement. So the theft was massive, as you saw in my slide, very cursory review. Throughout my tenure at TSMC as general counsel through at least 14, 15 period of time, we were involved, and our company coordinated with different intelligence agencies on a significant number of cases that are usually correctly below the radar that we don't become aware of. Also, there have been other cases in the Japan, China, Korea, Taiwan that are more visible there than they are to the US. The area that I have my greatest concern is some of the issues that have arisen concerning national security threats. And often the discussions without a lot of evidence, but perhaps the national security agencies have more evidence, is related to, are there embedded tracking devices and surveillance and other eavesdropping devices built into various China hardware? That's a much more difficult question because that's protected by secrecy rules of all countries. I do believe it's very real. However, as I found in the SMIC case, quite honestly, that company, while it made some missteps early in its career, I believe very religiously protects intellectual property these days. And I'm not aware of any, I've not seen any cases that would indicate anything to the contrary. So there is a lot of hype, I agree. And I think that the supply chain issue is also a lot of hype as well. There are some real issues, but I think the long-term effects are more illusory than they are real.
Very good. Dr. Zhu, do you have a question? Professor Zhu. Hello?
Mute. It's on mute.
You must be muted.
Sorry, no. I do have quite a few questions, but I thought that our audience still have a lot of questions here in the chat room.
Yeah, but it's
maybe
okay.
I'll ask a very quick one for Dick. So I think just a couple of days ago, the former Defense Department software chief said that China has invested a lot in the AI industry, and he believed that basically China has won the AI war with the United States, and many of the U.S. cyber defense systems were at the kindergarten level. Do you think he might be exaggerating, or what's your assessment? Do you agree with his assessment?
I don't agree with his success. I don't think anybody's won the war. We're just at a different phase of it where it's become more publicized. As you know, I think, Dr. Zhu, as most of you know on this call, the U.S. has been working quite extensively for decades on AI. When I was at Texas Instruments starting in the 80s, we had a division under George Heilmeyer that focused very much on AI. Much of our defense contracting, which I can't go into the details, but dealing with defense agencies was initially started then on AI-driven systems. I think that, again, the concern to me is more focused on what AI may be used for and whether or not it's more sophisticated by one country or another for eavesdropping and intelligence gathering. To me, again, what all the comments that I see are coming out are related to that element of it and what may be built into hardware. As many of you know, there's an awful lot of things that can be built into hardware these days with software programming. But the U.S. companies are very sophisticated. I, saw that from chip designers that did business and continue to do business with TSMC and others. So I don't think we've lost the war. I think we've gotten a little bit misdirected. I think that the biggest challenge that we've seen with both software development and then hardware development in the U.S. was the withdrawal of significant amount of funding for research institutes. So the legacy is there, but the ability to take it through different new tangents may be lacking. And that's where I really feel that Congress should be spending most of its money, not building new semiconductor chip manufacturing, but into R&D for our great institutions, such as the one that you're with, Dr. Zhu.
Thank you, Dick. That's great.
Okay.
Professor Feng, we still have quite a few questions. Do we have time for more questions?
Sure.
So I have time.
I think we have a nice question from Zhou Bao, B-A-O. Are you still there? Hello?
Yes, I'm still here.
Go ahead and ask your question. And show your face first. And also tell
sorry.
people who you are. Oh, this is your face.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I cannot show my face yet
Okay,
now.
tell people who you are.
Hello, I'm Zhiqun. I'm currently in New Haven now. I'm just a graduate student studying biomedical engineering, so I'm very curious about this issue, so I'm here. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk, Dr. Richard Thurston. So my question will be that we all know that recently a news came out that U.S. calling for the supply chain information from the chip companies such as TSMC and Samsung. And we all know that's very sensitive information. So considering we're talking about intellectual property, I know it's kind of irrelevant, but I'm still wondering, what do you think about this news? And then what's the influence on the chip companies that US is?
It's an excellent question, Ms. Bao. I think that it's certainly one that's very much in my mind and many other people. I'm actually shocked and taken aback, by the U.S. government trying to violate corporate trade secrets. I've been a very staunch defender. I created TSMC's trade secret program, which is world-class, which I'd also add, I've seen some comments by people saying that is TSMC the new Huawei. I take that as a personal insult. There's no other company in the world that has taken as much effort and serious effort to protect trade secrets, not just of its own, but also of its customers, and customers such as Qualcomm, TI, NVIDIA, and the like. For the US government to try to intrude and to obtain confidential proprietary information, to me, even violates our trade secret laws here in the United States. They're doing it under the guise of national security. But to me, it reminds me of the days when I was in Japan and the Japanese MIDI, as it was known then, would try to access confidential trade secret information from TI Japan. I fought it and pushed back and actually prevailed because we refused to provide that information. If I was advising TSMC, as I'm sure my successor is doing, I would be pushing back strongly. I do advise a couple of clients in this area, not any that I've mentioned here, but in the semiconductor industry, and I've been developing positions I can't share here, but I think it's a travesty of justice, quite honestly.
Thank you.
There's another one from, let's see, hold on. Wait a minute. Oh, I'm having difficulty. Stefano Bates, are you still there? Stefano Bates, B-A-T-E-S. Well, I'll read his his question. A very informative presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Richard, for the amazing presentation. I have a question related to the current status of the semiconductor disputes. Of the semiconductor
Disputes?
Oh, it's hard to read it. Have a comment to this current status of the semiconductor disputes. I lost it.
Okay, so you read the last question, right?
Why don't you
So-
read it? Why don't you, if someone can read it easily, I have difficulty
Okay.
reading it.
All right. Okay. So the question is about, okay, so there are reports stating that production in some car factories in China and elsewhere, like Germany, are having a hard time in keeping their production lines stable. So you think this will be the main drive for Biden administration to reach a compromise and be investment in intense negotiation with China? Or will this be a drive to escalate the tensions and pressures on China?
Well, I fear the latter, but I hope the former part of your question. And I am hopeful that the discussions that have been ongoing, but particularly the newer ones, will try to establish a greater degree of engagement. It's been unfortunate that actually we are experiencing a chain reaction that has complicated problems, and we are, all of us are starting to become well aware of it, because we're hearing in the news how even for the US and countries that celebrate Christmas, you're not going to be able to get your Christmas gifts in time. The logjam is that's being created, while it was probably set off by some of the trade disputes, has now become much more complicated. But also, COVID continues to cause impacts in the supply chain, as we have seen some countries now just starting to ramp up production because of that. I think what the USTR and Department of Commerce need to do is to come up with a creative approach with the world's second largest economy, or with the world's two largest economies, I should say, to find a solution that removes this logjam very quickly and allows U.S. companies also to recapture some of the manufacturing capability in China. The U.S., yes, should be focusing, as I said, and I think that Gina Raimondo, as Secretary of Commerce, is very much concerned about creating jobs, but also innovation in the U.S. And so I hope that some sort of strategic relationship can evolve. But it's a challenge. It's snowballing because of just the domino effect of what we are seeing out here today.
Okay, I have a question. One of the frightening things about the US-China technological animosity is the talk about decoupling. Do you think that if decoupling were to become a reality, would IPs in China and IPs in the US be decoupled as well? To me, as a layman, it seems impossible and frightening. What is your view on this?
Well, it's a real concern. I think it's a very good question, Da Hsuan, and is one that must be addressed by our government agency. So what's been happening is that, in effect, we're seeing the early stages of actually, it's not so early. As I mentioned on my train ride, China talked back in 1980 about being the world's patent leader. In other words, having more patents issued to Chinese companies than any other country in the world. That in itself is not necessarily bad if other countries such as the US invest in order to, in a sense, not let that happen, so that there's greater parity. The concern is, as many of you know, is that China's been working to adopt their own standards. whether or not it's in semiconductors, whether or not it's in 5G, whether or not it's in biomedical. And therefore, if these trade wars continue or a new one should come about, then what are the barriers to our, U.S. Western companies in a patent system that is alien or actually opposed to or is set up to fight against U.S. originated patents at the same time, while U.S. continues to accept China patents in its own IPO. So I'm very concerned that if decoupling were to exist from an economic point of view, then naturally IP is the result of people's innovations and really a result of the economic innovations that may exist that will create barriers worse than what the Great Wall of China once tried to prevent. So I am worried about it. It's a good question, and I think we need to do further study, looking at it. But the way that it's enforced, right? Each country, in the United States, as I said before, when I joined Texas Instruments, we could not get trade secrets protected even in Texas, right? So, just think what if there was trade secret misappropriation, and then you could not get that enforced in China, because much of it has to be done in that jurisdiction where the crime is actually being implemented in order to get protection. That's what we did with
the very idea of IP, intellectual property, is buried in it is a global concept.
Right.
I mean, if you only have IPs for your own country and other people can use it because they are decoupled from you, then it loses all meaning.
Exactly. I agree. It creates more barriers, and it creates, really what I call the IP wars, so a new generation of war and fighting that then drives, and we had the discussion, a little bit before about AI and software, all of that is constantly driven, particularly when you're looking at the sophisticated nature of new technologies. The nanotechnology innovations are mind-boggling as to its potential impact on us. So, right. But you're absolutely correct, and I think we need to have more discussion about that.
Are there any more questions from the audience?
Yes, I think there's another question from.
Okay, go ahead. Who is it? Someone raised a question.
Yeah. This is Hugh Ching.
Oh, please show your face.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let me see.
And tell people who you are.
Yeah, I'm Hugh Ching. I'm the founder of Post Science. My question is all stated in full in the questionnaire. And my picture in the morning is different from my picture in the dance floor.
Welcome. Okay, no problem.
Here's my question. Okay, here's my question. Okay, we come here, expect to talk about China. Okay, my question is, what is your solution to peace? Okay, as I'm talking right now, I'm talking to Neil Ferguson and to Hoover Institution about this question. Okay, the main question is, what is the solution to peace? It's not the solution to IT or to intellectual property. See, there is a real serious question. You see, I have asked that in my question, so you can go read it. Okay, I stated clearly why I asked this question, so the audience will not think I'm just coming in with some disrupting the movement of the talk. You see, so basically, I like to know everyone can give me what they think is the way to solve the problem of the U.S.-China conflict today.
I think it's a tremendous question that unfortunately does go unanswered. We've seen many books. Was it Friedman wrote guns, germs, and steel. And, unfortunately, when it comes to the military, when it comes to, cybersecurity threats, technology is what's driving it. And what we, as I said, I believe very strongly that Commerce Department and other agencies, USTR, must put some of this baggage behind us and start to have some dialogue where they look for that answer. Unfortunately, we're more driven by fear and paranoia. There is reality. As I said, I experienced it very much with the SMIC trade secret theft case, but I unfortunately don't have an answer. But I see your question here. It's it's certainly very good, and the works you reference do of course raise more aspects to that than what we can discuss here. But I thank you for raising it again. It's something we need to keep in the forefront of our minds.
Thanks. Anybody else? I'm going to talk to Neil Ferguson possibly, and also Hoover Institution. You see, we'll try to collect this the solution. Any suggestions? Anything would be good. I think in the past it seemed like Trump seemed to be going into the direction of peace, but now, Biden is moving toward military conflict. Okay, that is the wrong direction. Okay, but if anybody
thank you.
has any solution, like my mentor. And Professor Feng, you have any suggestion?
I'm not in the government.
Well, I think what we have to do is though put more pressure on our own representatives to try to improve dialogue. Which is, and I have talked with Senator Schumer's staff and others, about that. It's so crucial, and stop, going from one extreme to the other. Like I said, these trade wars throughout our history have not netted a lot of goodwill. And what had happened, quite honestly, I take my experiences with Japan and with TI and the trade wars that existed there. And there is a good example, because I was involved directly in TI, led the way under Jerry Junkins. We were very actively involved. I was very actively involved in the various trade discussions that took place. And we negotiated 2 different semiconductor agreements with Japan, which actually redefined the relationship and allowed TI to obtain significant market share in Japan. Whereas when we started all that, and we filed our first volley of lawsuits, we only were selling $200 million of semiconductors a year in Japan, where we had 5 manufacturing plants. Right? We were blocked. But dialogue, discussion, and in that case, on the ground, because I was on the ground, was huge, and started to sway it, and also ultimately convinced Japan, as we did Korea and Taiwan, to, in this case, protect its intellectual property as a means to enhance innovation in your own local country. So dialogue is absolutely important. If we don't have it, and if we don't reestablish it in a very meaningful way, then we are in deep trouble. I think, having been close to a number of folks also in the Trump administration, the frustrations that were felt by the Trump administration, and keep in mind, Trump's economic advisors and trade advisors were there from day one to the last day. They've been through this before, and their greatest frustrations was the lack of really honest, hard discussions on IP, on technology, on things that you mentioned, Hugh, and that was ignored for whatever reasons. And now we're paying the price for that. We must have dialogue, or else we being the Western world, and then we being the Chinese world, nobody will benefit from that. We'll only suffer.
Yes, yes.
Right.
I agree. I make a comment on the Japanese trade war. Okay, I did some surveys. It seemed like the key to the success of US against Japan was the revaluation of the yen. You see,
Well,
about 3 times. No, so
part of it
that's
was true. Part of it was true, but also what we did at TI, and really laid the path is we did, of course, sue in Japanese. And what had happened is that when we started that, people don't realize that at the beginning of that, warfare through the courts, TI was down to around $50 million a day in cash. A company that had 96,000 people worldwide in 46 countries, as close as you're going to get to failure. And it was because the cost differential between, US and Japan for semiconductor and advanced technology was huge. Well, what happened is it closed and ultimately became a parity and maybe even flipped in the favor of, in that case, TI.
Yes.
Similar thing has been allowed to happen as well when it comes to, manufacturing costs, technology transfer, and the variety of things. And again, because the US has not had a comprehensive policy focusing on that, we're suffering from that, as are many other, countries themselves. So, we have to also have a lot of internal dialogue. I agree there are threats, but at the same time, we also have to try to identify them and then have a dialogue so that, China doesn't get, fearful of its own boundaries and its borders, right? Being protected. Look now, not only do we have Taiwan, we have India, getting hot again, and those issues are going to continue to unravel unless we have more meaningful dialogue.
Right. Dr. Zhu, why don't you ask the last question? I think time is almost up.
Well, I do have I see another question in the chat room. I don't know whether this person is still here or not. Ming Yuan Zhao is still here or not? No.
Well, go ahead and ask your question. You had one or two that you had sent me before that were actually very good, very prescient. So go ahead.
Well, which one do you do you like? I mean,
You pick one, Dr. Zhu. Yeah.
I think part of your focus was actually on 5G, right? And which is really in part at the core of this issue. And as people may not be aware, in the United States, and particularly in communities where I am living, 5G is a hot topic that even domestically at the grassroots level, people fear 5G as being a way to eavesdrop in the home, right? There's a lot of suspicion, distrust at the local level about our local companies that are putting out 5G, let alone about China or the US intelligence agency. So go ahead, ask any of your questions.
I mean, it's not a really question, but I think, just maybe a brief comment. I think, Dick, you covered pretty well in your presentation about the, historical approach and with your, personal experience. I think you mentioned these cultural differences between China, between the West, China and the West. I think that's very important for us to understand, this IP dispute right now. Because as we all know that the Western culture emphasizes, individualism and rewards creativity, entrepreneurship. The Chinese traditional culture really emphasizes communal way of living, and where people share a lot of things, including ideas. So this IP is really an alien concept, to China, to many Chinese, even today. I mean, I remember, back in 1980s, when I was a college student in Shanghai, I used to go to this Shanghai foreign language bookstore where you could find all kind of publications in English, other foreign languages, from textbooks to these English or American novels, from dictionaries to all these reference books on TOEFL and GREs. But everything was copied. Everything was pirated. So and even into the 1990s, you could still buy these counterfeit products in open market, Shanghai or Beijing, these handbags, I think China has come a long way, in building this legal system, especially IP. I remember, but right after the Cultural Revolution, you mentioned actually many legal scholars, including yourself, were in China to help China build this legal system after the Cultural Revolution. I wonder, is there still that kind of cooperation between China and the United States in terms of helping China to develop or strengthen this IP system? And for the United States, I guess, instead of accusing or complaining about China all the time of, stealing information, stealing trade secrets, perhaps a better approach is to actually help China to understand that, this is actually in China's own interest, to protect, IPs. So what has the U.S. government or what have U.S. business done, in order to, narrow the gap between the two sides instead of arguing with each other and, filing all these lawsuits,
It's an extremely important, point in question. And in fact, I believe that our own experiences in Japan, Korea, Taiwan are illustrative of what can be done with further exchange, dialogue, and removing some of the suspicions. What unfortunately has intervened is this whole national security issue that is perceived to be a systemic problem. I agree with the previous, with the question that was asked, a half hour ago, is that oftentimes the extent of the alleged theft, misappropriation is far greater than the actual level. It does exist. I think that most companies, even the US, I don't know what the US government's level of exchange has been in the last year, but certainly there was very active ongoing exchanges between, the ministries, between, private business. There still is, of course, a significant amount of private business that is going on. You take TSMC, for example, it has not shut down and hasn't come close. Texas Instruments, Intel, various other U.S. companies or U.S. technology-driven companies, such as TSMC, are not shutting down those operations. They're restricted, perhaps, on what they can do, what comes under export control, but huge amount of business still continues. We have, at the crossroads where other factors are in play, which is really the struggle within the leadership in Beijing. And at the same time, you have many wealthy business people, men and women in China, that are frustrated. Of course, some of them are going to jail, some of them are being delisted, but they don't approve of that. And they've seen IP as being also a way to protect their economic value, right? Assets. So I've been encouraged, really until, things have started to fall apart in the last year. I had been encouraged that we would continue to make progress. And you're right. From the first day that I stepped foot in China, where it was a desert land when it came to intellectual property, huge progress made, just like in China and Taiwan. And, Japan, the first day within the first month that I was in Tokyo in my office, and one day I came back from lunch early and I caught my secretary, my assistant, who was a very, very capable and important person, but she was reading all the documents on my desk. I said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Those are confidential." I said, "Well, if you want them confidential, why are you leaving them open on your desk and your door open?" Well, good point. But it's the concepts that we are still have the baggage from, but we must have that interchange. That's the only way you break down and learn. And same thing with the US. We need to learn more about foreign cultures, and particularly Chinese culture. If you look at what is in, the problem is that we have fewer and fewer well-qualified people in the government sector when it comes to international affairs, let alone Chinese affairs.
I think we are coming to an end. But
Okay.
since 5G was mentioned, I would like to use that as my question to be the last one as a roundup. You know, 5G obviously is so hot and it sort of started this whole thing. I just went on Google yesterday to search something about 5G IPs. And the comment that came from Google is that, quote, when counting granted 5G patent families only, Samsung owns the largest 5G portfolios, followed by LG, Nokia, and then Huawei. This means that Huawei does not have the largest number of IPs in 5G. So my questions are as follows, and I'll just ask the whole in total, and you can answer any way you like. How come Huawei with the least number of IPs, that is compared with Samsung, LG, and Nokia? The conventional wisdom is that, of course, that Huawei is the leader in the 5G technology. Shouldn't the conventional wisdom be that if you have the most IPs, you must have done the most research in the field? How come Huawei's 5G technology is leading the world and not Samsung, LG, and Nokia? Second, what is the reason for the US seems to be completely out of the game of 5G? Is this the reason why the US government is so deeply worried? And finally, why is TSMC not in the game of 5G IPs? Thank you.
Well, boy, I could write a book on that.
I'm sure. Or two.
Let me try to simply address a couple things. First, traditional issue in intellectual property is one of quantity versus quality. I have not analyzed the portfolios, but I know that Samsung made a practice of getting, it's the same with IBM, you know, more volume than that may be quality. You know, I have not studied 5G patents, so I don't know who has the best quality. But I know years ago, you know, when this was back when, after I first arrived at, I think it was in 2003 or 4, you'll find this interesting. One day I get a call, you know, from a Chinese gentleman. I wanted to get together for lunch in Taipei. So I met, that gentleman was the new general counsel for intellectual property at Huawei, sitting in Taipei. He was allowed to come in to Taipei, you know, without any questions asked. He said, Dick, what do we need to do, you know, to develop patent portfolio or to follow what I was starting to do at TSMC? TSMC, when I joined, they were filing 1,200 patent applications a year. Waste of money and time at that point in time. I focused on quality. That's what I said to him. I said, look, you need to focus on quality of patents rather than quantity of patents. And I went through that process. You know, we've had, you know, the issue with Samsung is when TI first sued Samsung back in the mid 80s, guess how many semiconductor patents they had? 0. They had 0 semiconductor patent in their portfolio. Where did they start to get it after our lawsuit? Honeywell. They were buying US portfolios, but they developed a policy of volume. Rather, you know, they have quality patents, don't get me wrong. There are a lot of quality patents, but there's volume. So you can't just look at it based on numbers. And that's one thing. Second of all, what has happened in the US, I don't think that the US is lagging. You know, I look at a number of companies, but one aspect that you'll remember that I still attribute to being a problem in our telecom space in the United States. Remember when I was in, you know, Plano and Richardson, right, and I was a key element, you know, with, you know, what we called the telecom corridor. Remember that, Da Hsuan? And I was, you know, in there, and actually that's how Huawei came to invest in R&D in Plano area. I got them to come and to invest. So what happened in 2000, 2001, that time frame, telecom corridor collapsed.
That's right.
Telecom corridor was the center in the United States and the world probably at that time for telecom R&D and development, so forth. And many of the companies that were there in, you know, the Dallas region closed down. particularly like Northern Telecom, right? One of the
Nortel.
largest patent holders in this area, well, in the earlier areas of the G technologies. You know,
Right.
Samsung, Ericsson, Nokia, right?
They're all
TI,
here.
you know, you go through, it all collapsed, you know, and we've been playing catch up in many ways since then. However, you know, I think that, you know, with, you know, what Huawei has done, and this follows your theme as well, you know, they've really basically taken and developed a digital Silk Road, you know, throughout the world. The US hasn't really done that, and we've ignored Europe. Finally, I'll disagree with you on, and some of the critics out there about TSMC. I quite honestly believe that TSMC, you know, and I know what we had done and can't talk about it from when I was there, but had focused a lot of energy, a lot of time and effort into the various generations, 3G, 4G, 5G patents and technology. And in fact, they developed a key initiative, which still exists, very strong, called, well, in the RF Internet of Things space. And when you look at their core customers today, who are the leaders in the semiconductor and also cell phone technologies, Apple, Qualcomm, you know, NVIDIA, to MediaTek, right? To name a few, they're all leaders in different 5G applications. And so TSMC has really, you know, as it's gotten into the 5 to 3 nanometer area, has had record sales in this area for this, you know, technology. It's something that, again, you know, hasn't really been discussed, right? But their smartphone platforms, which depend on these advanced technologies, are quite significant if you look at their technology base. So, you know, that's all I'll say about that. But you can't rule them out, count them out at all on this area.
Well, thank you very much. I think, however, you know, I think we can go on for another 5 hours of this discussion, because the issues are so broad and deep. I hope maybe we can have another one of this discussion with some other issues built around IPs. It is really tremendous. Dick, do you want to give a less than 30 seconds of summary of what you want to say here?
Well, you know, what I want to say is that IP is extremely crucial to innovation, technology, economic development in both countries. We have somewhat of a disagreement. Yeah, of all countries, but certainly, yes, definitely. And, you know, we have different cultures that take a different approach to it. We have many countries that are still evolving in areas of IP. I'm also an international advisor to the IIPCC, which is the International Intellectual Property Commercialization Center in Hong Kong. I think Johnson Kong's on here today. We've been making a lot of efforts. We just got a new country in Cameroon joining us on our IP initiative. So we have to keep getting the word out. We have to educate, but dialogue is a couple of the questions have focused on is so important. We have a lot of distrust, you know, which has to be overcome. Yes. Is there theft of trade secrets? You know, is there infringement of patents? There sure are. You look at the number of cases in the United States alone against other US companies, you know, not just Chinese, you know, companies, or against European companies or African companies. You know, it's mind-boggling. You know, it's created a whole industry for lawyers, quite honestly. So, you know, we have to do better in getting people to understand this fundamental value in the way that we transact business is to recognize and to protect creativity and innovation, you know, and try to continue to build, you know, world intellectual property organizations trying to continue to build a common policy and platform. We have to continue to encourage our representatives, especially our state and local people that don't have a clue about intellectual property, quite honestly. I'm here in New York and very much involved. I wear a second hat, which is a supervisor, or also known as a mayor of a town of 30,000 people. The number of people that know what intellectual property means is almost zilch. So anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah. Well, I think that perhaps this lays the good foundation for further discussions of these fundamental issues. What I learned today from Professor Zhu's question, I thought it was very profound. is that intellectual property is not just a legal machinery. It is also a cultural machinery. And if you don't insert culture into it, you will run into trouble.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, thank you for everyone's patience and
Thank you.
participation and active participation. I would consider this as a success. I think so would
And-
everyone else. Thank you
And
very
thanks
much.
to World Scientific.
Yeah, thanks to
Terry.
World Scientific.
Great job, Dick.
Yep.
Thank you very
Dick,
much.
great
you.
job. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care, everyone. Have a good day, whichever part of the day you're on. Bye-bye.
For joining us.
Thank you. Thanks,